We'll start the second part of this recording by discussing the scientific method. And in this part of the discussion, which will be modestly shorter than our first discussion, we will talk about how we go about making a scientific observation, etc. And we will do a couple of examples of how to go about executing the scientific method. The scientific method starts with what is known as an observation or a series of observations. And what this means is that a person goes out into nature and they make an observation. They see something that happens in nature. They might write it down or just take note of it. They may make an observation about behavior of an animal or a behavior of themselves or the behavior of the universe around them. And they write these observations down. Then, generally, they take that observation and they begin to do research about it. You know, we'll use the example of an old adage that said, "Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning." Now, what that was supposed to mean is if you observed a red sky, that meant the weather that day was going to be potentially a storm was going to occur at that, and it would be bad for anybody that would be on the seas at the time. So let's say that the first observation that the individual makes is he got up that morning and he said, "There's a red sky today," and later in the day there was a storm. So he says, and he had noticed that 2 or 3 times this has happened. So his observation is, red sky in the morning doesn't seem to be too good. There must be a problem. So he goes off and he begins to do research. And what he wants to doing the research for is he wants to find out what's already known about this. And let's just pretend, for the sake of this example, that not much is known about the situation. And so the next thing he goes on is he changes his observation into a question that can be tested. Okay. So his question might be something to the form of, whenever a red sky occurs in the morning hours, does that mean there's going to be a storm that day? Bad weather that day, let's just say it that way. So that's a question. When a red sky occurs, does that mean it's going to be a bad day? Now, it has to be a testable question in order to be part of the scientific method. You can't ask a question like, if the red sky occurs in the morning, does that mean that God is upset with the ship and it's going to rain on the ship? Well, you can't test whether God is upset. So it has to be a testable question. And you turn that testable question into something called a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is an educated guess to answer the question and explain the observation. And so you say, yes, when a red sky occurs, it means it's going to rain. It means that there's a greater chance of rain. Let's put it that way. Let's not make it too definitive. And so the predictions you would make is on the days that the red sky comes out, the chances of rain would be greater than the days that there are not a red sky. And then you would move on to do experimentation. And experimentation represents a series of controlled, and the key word here is controlled observations that test the hypothesis. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about experimentation because I do that in the basic science class. And so if you've already had basic science, you already know this. And if you haven't had basic science yet, when we do that next year, we'll go over this. The things like controlled variable, uncontrolled variables, etc. let's just say, for the sake of this lecture, that we conducted an experiment to test our prediction. So in some way, we set up at where when we get up in the morning and we don't see a red sky, we look and see if it rains. And the days we do see a red sky, we look and see if it rains. And we basically compare those two sets of observations to see if there's a difference in the percent chance of rain compared to when the sky is red. And lastly, we use the data from that, and what we're doing in this situation is either accepting our hypothesis or rejecting it. We cannot use the data for anything other than to accept what we've said, the yes, a red sky does indicate a greater chance of rain, or no, it does not indicate a greater chance of rain. It's important not to take the data that you have beyond your asked question. Now, the data that you have can suggest new questions that you would want to answer in a separate experiment. But you should not go beyond the conclusion, go beyond the hypothesis when you state your conclusion. Now, some people add another part to this called validation, where you do a similar set of experiments to validate the result of this experiment. That is not necessarily in all people's writings about the scientific method necessary. So when we talk about scientific method, we have to understand that in doing this, we generate a series of understandings or results that become part of the body of knowledge that we have. And those results can ultimately become what is known as a theory. So if you look at this diagram, you see on the left is the scientific method going through its process. And you start with your hypotheses and predictions, you do your experiments and observations, and you can make conclusions, etc., etc. And as this wheel turns, out pops results that form what we call a body of knowledge that we have. Now, one way of categorizing that body of knowledge is to call something a theory. A theory is a hypothesis that has been tested several times, multiple times, and is supported by a significant amount of data. Now, when laymen use the term theory, many times it implies what we think of when we think of hypothesis, which is just an educated guess. But in a scientific context, the statement of a theory is much more encompassing and much more sure and certain than a hypothesis, and then what many laymen mean when they talk about a theory. To call the theory of evolution a theory, and that means it's, just a guess, is to risk being laughed at by the scientific community. Because remember, it's also the theory of relativity, which has been strongly supported by scientific understanding for a long time. And also so be very careful when you use the term theory, and don't overly be negative about that term. That term suggests something that is fairly well accepted. Now, that being said, it's important also to understand that most of the theories that have ever been created since science was performed have been proven wrong. There was the theory of the caloric transfer of heat, which said that heat was transferred by a physical material known as the caloric. And this caloric passed from one material to another, and that's why things either heated up or cooled off. And subsequently, it was proven that that was not true. There was no material passed from one object to another. Another theory was the ether theory of the travel of light, that light was a mechanical wave that traveled through a material that was all around us called an ether. And this was accepted up until, the early 20th century. And obviously more recently it's been shown that there is no such material. So while I caution you not to be overly skeptical of something because it's called a theory, I also say that understand that as our understanding progresses, we end up rejecting a lot of things that we believe to be true in the past. Now, the other way that scientific knowledge can be divided is to call something a law. Now, a law is more certain than a theory. A law is a tested theory that has been consistent over generations of data. For example, the law of gravity is a law that has been tested for centuries and has still been very consistent. But even laws can come under scrutiny over a period of time. But understand, when something's called a law, it means that it's pretty well certain. So the scientific method was used, and I just use this as an example of how they used the scientific method to prove something else. This was a study to look at spontaneous generation. There was a huge debate in the 1800s about whether spontaneous generation actually occurred. And the idea of spontaneous generation was that simple life can occur from non-living chemical reactions. And so, for example, non-living meat could produce simple life forms, which were maggots in this case. What they did to prove this not to be true, I'll show you in just a second. But this spontaneous generation was also called abiogenesis, which is the origin, genesis of life, bio being life, but a meaning that you didn't have to have life originally in order to produce life. So it's an idea that you can produce life from non-living things, sort of the Frankenstein idea, for lack of a better way of putting it. Now, most of the reason that this was a controversy was because of the problem of microorganisms. Microorganisms are living creatures that are too small to be seen by the unaided eye, and in the 1800s was around the time when microscopes were just coming into being. And so a lot of scientists didn't realize that there were organisms or living forms there that actually ended up producing life. Now, what this shows, this experiment, the first jar was open and the flies came in, the maggots would form. The second jar was sealed, and it was sealed with a non-penetrable seal. So the presence of the meat was not out, the odor and things that would cause the exterior environment to know that there's meat there could not penetrate the cork that was in the second. The third, it was covered with a permeable material that allowed the smell and so forth, and the flies would come and the maggots formed on the top. And what this proved is that the meat was not the genesis of the maggots, but the flies were the genesis of the maggots, and the maggots represented the larval forms of the flies. And so that was one of the proofs that was used in the old days to prove that spontaneous generation did not occur. Okay, we're going to wrap up and move on to biological classification in the third section of this video.